We said climate affects species and human activities are also affecting species, but how exactly are the species being affected? So, it depends on where you are in the food chain or the so called trophic level. Here is an example that shows that. So, there is a climate variability called North Atlantic mode. Basically, it is a pressure variation between Iceland and Azores, and that changes the wind direction, the strength of the wind, amount of rain, and when the strength of the wind changes, the mixing of the upper ocean changes, that changes the food supply and so on. So, if you look at the response of the ecosystem to these NAO changes, you can then translate this to any human induced change. This North Atlantic mode is a natural mode, but you can also include climate changes there. So, when you change wind pattern and cloud cover, photosynthesis and phytoplankton change in the ocean, and that affects the zooplankton which eat the phytoplankton, and the zooplankton are also directly affected by the temperature and the salinity of the water that is coming in, because their own metabolic rate depends on the changes in the temperature, and the zooplankton supply affects the fish like capelin and young herring, and they themselves are also affected by changes in temperature and sea ice extent. So, each level is being affected by some climate change plus the food they depend on. If phytoplankton is affected, the food supply to zooplankton is affected, the zooplankton growth rate and reproduction itself is also affected by the temperature change and so on. So, somebody who is at the top of the food chain like cod is affected by temperature and wind pattern, but also the integration of all these effects coming from the bottom of the food chain. This is what we have to remember. So, you can imagine there is somebody else who is eating cod. It could be human beings, it could be a sea lion, it could be somebody else, it could be a whale and so on. So, the ecosystem is basically integrating the climate impacts at each level, and somebody who is sitting at the top, could be us, is being affected by the integration of all these climate change signals. It is somewhat looking at grain production, for example. If we are affecting climate, we are affecting CO2 and temperature, that affects the growth rates and crop yields. It also affects the uptake of micronutrients like iron and zinc in the crops, for example, and we might add pesticides which affects things, the crops as well. The change in the rainfall rate also affects the rate at which they grow and so on. So, essentially ecosystem is always integrating the climate signal through the whole food web. This is what you have to remember to understand the net impact on the ecosystem at any level.